Hi, this is Umi Dashtari.
And Natasha McElhone.
Today we're talking to Paul Bennet. Paul is a designer. For 23 years, he worked at design and innovation powerhouse IDEO, where he was chief creative officer and then co-CEO. There he was responsible for content excellence across the whole firm and was active in developing and publishing new thinking in the field of human-centered and design-led innovation.
Today, Paul is a senior advisor at McKinsey, where he continues to provide creative leadership and cross-pollination of insights and ideas to clients and colleagues on an extended scale by traveling, learning, and working across the globe. Paul has taught and coached students from the Royal College of Art in England, Stanford University, and Columbia Business School. Most recently, he taught on the master's program at KHiO in Oslo and at the Iceland Academy of Arts in Reykjavík.
We talk about redesigning death,
losing parents,
digital remains of our lives,
death is a universal market opportunity,
using the full extent of the design space death provides,
the pursuit of immortality,
euthanasia.
Who matters more, the dying or the left behind? Let's design.
Hi, this is Umi Dashtari.
And Natasha McElhone. And today with us we have
Paul Bennet.
Hi,
Hey,
Paul.
Hi everybody.
Thanks for joining us. We are going to talk about many things today, but predominantly about death. But before we jump in there, for our listeners who may not be familiar with the discipline of design, I think it would be interesting if you tell us a little bit about how you think about design and what your philosophy is when you're approaching and designing new projects, products, and other things.
All right, this goes back to when I was 11 years old. When I was 11 years old, I was one of those weird nerdy kids that lived in my bedroom, sort of Billy Elliot, and sort of fantasizing about worlds outside of my own. And there was a TV show called Blue Peter, which the British viewers may or may not know. And there was a contest, an art contest. And this year, the contest was to draw a Yeti. And so I didn't draw a Yeti. I designed Yeti World. And I designed the house in which the Yeti lived, and the Yeti's family, and the Yeti system, and the Yeti's car, and the Yeti this, and the Yeti that, and the Himalayas, and the whole 9 yards. And I won a Blue Peter badge. And so I guess I went from being a weird art kid to being possibly artistic. But I worked my way through the design profession. I worked in design, I worked in advertising. And eventually, sort of after many years, started my own business, moved to New York, started my own business, which was then a branding agency. This was when I think I first took the fact that I was doing this seriously and it took me seriously. That was in the mid to early 90s. And then I went to San Francisco and found a company there called IDEO, who are still in business, big Silicon Valley design company, where I worked for 23 years. And worked my way through everything, from product to service to experience to healthcare to government. And I guess the theme would be at increasing scale, with increasing impact, and an increasing desire to do things that mattered. I am increasingly less interested as I've gotten older. I'm 62 now. And as I've gotten older, I've got increasingly less interested in creating ephemeral things, and increasingly more interested in creating meaningful things, which will lead us into the conversation, hopefully, that we're about to have.
With that in mind, so you've spent a career designing beginnings, products and experiences and systems that aim to make life better.
Yes, I think so.
And you've said that has changed in terms of not making things anymore, but perhaps redesigning our approach to things or ways of living, ways of being. So
Correct.
What drew you to the idea of redesigning death? And tell me, what was some of it because you had a go at designing most other things and you have a designer's instinct to look where no one else wants to look? Or I know you have personal experiences and a close brush with death yourself. But just with your design hat on for a moment, tell us what led you through that portal.
A friend of mine once described design as like going into a cave with a torch and looking to see where the walls were. And I love the idea of sort of shining a torch inside of a dark space and looking where the walls glistened, right? So a large part of it, and she described this as going into the void. And I always like that phrase of going into the void, going into the space that is difficult, the void. So part of me, yes, was wired to look for the void. Part of me was looking for challenges which I had not seen. I'd also been on a journey of having gone to places of the world where I'd been confronted with shocking things, with poverty, with despair. I told the story when I was there of going into Congo and seeing things there, of seeing in India, of seeing things that I never thought that I would see. So part of me was curious about what I could bring to the darker spaces. But then my dad died. And my dad didn't just die. The person who gave me everything died. And my father gave me my creative start in life. My father was the person who most believed in me. My father was the person who put me on this path. So yes, my parent died, but the metaphor was much deeper than that for me. My pilot died. And he didn't just die. He didn't just die like keel over, have a heart attack and died. He died in the way that you don't want to die, and in the way that he talked about for years, please don't let me die like that. He used to make jokes, if I can't wipe my arse, get me out of here. And then he couldn't. And if I can't do this, don't let me. And if you're spoon feeding me, oh my God. And then we were. So, what started one day as my dad falling off a ladder turned out to be spinal cancer, turned out to be my father wired into a wall for the next year. And the last part of that was a horrifying process. And I was abroad. And so I was trying so hard to try and get somebody to just tell me the truth. And that sounds like such a loaded statement, tell me the truth. That's one of the hardest things to get out of the system. Just tell me the truth. Is he going to? Where is he on this? Will this happen? Everybody would sort of dance around with that. So it wasn't just my dad died. It was my dad died in the way that I would never have wanted my father to die. The last interaction I had with him, I was in LA. And I called him. I remember it as if it was yesterday. I called him and he picked up. They put him through to his hospital ward. And I said, how are you? And he said, as British military guys do, the most understated way possible. He said, I'm not so good, son. And I said, Dad, I'm coming home. And he said, and these words to this day chill me to the bone, he said, I don't want you to come. I don't need you to see me like this. And it was those words that were the last things he said to me. He died the next day. Many ways, that was the brief. That was the thing that catalyzed. That was the creative brief. That was the liberation in many ways of seeing what I didn't want to see, but had to see. And in many ways, it was the thing that then catalyzed me into, excuse me, I'm choking up even speaking it, but it was the thing that catalyzed me into this. I'm going to go into the cave with the torch immediately, and I'm going to start looking around here because I cannot not honor him and this by just allowing this moment to pass. So that's what led me into that journey.
Thanks for sharing that, Paul. It's nice to see other people being vulnerable and talking about something that we will all have to face at some point in our lives. What did you see in that cave when you started using that torch? Everybody
is what you see in the cave. You just said it. You just answered the question. You see everybody. Everybody's in there. Everybody's got a story. So I went out sort of publicly, as I often did, and said, death, what the fuck? Somebody should redesign death. And I woke up the next morning with my inbox just bursting. And it was bursting with actually what I would describe as three needs, three insights The biggest one was the first one, which was just everybody's desire to tell you their story, to not have their story go into the void, but for their story to be recognized. My brother committed suicide. My father did this. My mother did this. This happened to me. This happened to someone else. Let me tell you my story. Even if you didn't reply, which obviously I wasn't able to, saying it out loud was an act of catharsis. So that was one thing that the cave illuminated, was just everyone has a story. Everybody has a story, even if it's a pet dying. It doesn't matter who it is. Everyone's experienced, everyone has touched this in some way, shape, or form. The second bucket was nobody knew what the fuck to do about it. Everybody said the system's broken. And then you would go, well, which part of the system? And they go, I don't know, but the system. Well, can you talk about the system? I don't know. It's just the system. It's just a system. It's just goes on forever. And no one could identify where the breaking points were other than it was broken. But nobody could tell you what it was. Just somewhere between health insurance and end-of-life directive and nurses doing things to you that you didn't want to do, and your dad begging to die, and somebody asking, as I did, is he going to die? And somebody saying, I can't tell you that. And all of these kind of broken membranes, if you like. That was the second bucket, was sheer frustration that there was so little linearity in a complex world, right? The third bucket, which was actually the most interesting, but the smallest, was everybody had a million ideas for how it could be better. And as a boomer, I think we've seen so much change in our lifetime. We've seen so many other things get eradicated, and yet death is Victorian, right? Death is this weird Victorian cover up the piano legs and shut the curtains kind of thing. And yet everybody wanted there to be a different death. The number of times somebody said to me, I don't want to die like my dad. I don't want to die like my grandparents. I don't want to die like X, Y, Z. And what about if we did a million things? And they went from the most absurd hippie burial under a sequoia tree, awesome things, all the way through to, I mean, one company I actually became quite obsessed with, who were a Dutch company, who were able to turn cremation ashes into jewels, into diamonds, which was just magnificent, right? So it went from a desperate desire to speak, a desperate frustration at the inability to navigate, to a desperate desire to see change happen. And those three things were what came at me on day one, and have never stopped coming at me, frankly. I mean, I've had people still say, you're the death guy. And I'm like, oh God, well, not really. But, I looked at it. Well, what's going on? And, and so there's glimmers of things. But one of my learnings, sorry, I know I'm taking up a lot of air here too, but one of my learnings over now doing this for quite some time is time is a design tool. I mean, we've been dealing with death in the same way for thousands and thousands of years. So to just say overnight, I'm going to have a brainstorm and, hey, death, we're going to redesign you in 48 hours with an app, put my own naivety into that. It's a naive act to assume. Death is a long cultural arc, which takes many, many years, many generations for people to change. I will say, though, that there are now more of us that are going, it can't be like this, than ever before. And that's the thing that I'm taking the most heart from at this point.
Makes sense. I've worked on digital products in the past. And when we think about, for instance, UX design on a mobile phone, we know the constraints that are given to us by the design of the phone. It's rectangular, it has that many pixels, etc. There are a lot of constraints that this particular problem is presenting us with that we need to take into consideration as we're designing. I would say the most glaring is that this thing is very random. That the mere fact of wanting to bring agency and somehow organization into something that can be completely chaotic and come out of nowhere seems to be an oxymoron in some ways. How would you address that?
The answer is yes. There's no one answer. There is no one answer to death. It's not digital or analog. It's both. It depends on how you treat it. There is no memorial, headstone, no headstone. Do you do a playlist? Do you plan your funeral? I've been to one of it, every single one of those. What there needs to be is choice. And that's the thing. And you need to get into that choice mode much earlier than you are ready to. One of the things that was very obvious to us was death was a surprise to everybody who was dying. Everyone was like, holy shit, I'm dying. Fuck, now what do I do? Including myself. I told Natasha I had a heart attack. I'm lying and staring up at the roof going, oh, fuck, I haven't made an end-of-life directive. Do I do it now before I die? I mean, what do I do? I'm about to die, aren't I? So one of the things, again, I'm going to use this phrase several times, time is of the essence. And one of the insights that we found very, very early, and which I have to say, I think I hold on to as a very interesting thought, who you are able to speak about death with is quite interesting, right? The fact that the three of us can have this conversation about death and it not be weird is actually not coincidental. Now, can you have that conversation with your wife or with your partner? Slightly more different. So one of the things we used to talk about, this idea of, we used to call it the big chill death, but the idea of having a peer group who are all in the same space that you can actually start to have a conversation with much earlier on with. You can actually say, if it was me, I'd want this. Can you please do this for me? If it was me, I'd need X. Can you please take care of that for me? So the idea of who you talk about death with and with whom is a design opportunity. At the moment, it tends to be too late, in crisis, and rushed. I mean, if I can tell a very personal story, buying my father's headstone was possibly the lowest point of his death, because he'd already died. My mother was distraught. We're at some shitty local funeral home, and this dude is trying to upsell my mother on a piece of stone and saying, well, he would have wanted the best. And I'm like, he would have wanted none of this. So that is, to me, that's the opposite of what it should be. Now how you bring it in to and again, the word that I will use many times is, how do you normalize this to the point where you get to it much earlier, much more normally, in a much more sort of fluid way, so that you feel like you're in control rather than it's too late. I'm stroking out. I'm in a hospital bed staring at the roof. Do I have to choose my headstone now? Or do I have to tell the person next to me?
In a sense, even though you fully accept that it's messy and often undignified and never on our terms, unless, well, we're going to talk about euthanasia maybe in a minute, but yeah. Putting that aside, the sort of fail to prepare to fail philosophy, it's an obligation that you make certain decisions quite early on in life about how the people around you may organize this, or you write a list of ways that you would want it to happen in an ideal world, and if those are available. So you're not, as well as the shock and the crisis of dying, you're not dealing with all the other practical...
You don't die twice, you die once.
Yeah.
And there's nothing worse than dying twice. Everybody says,
well, unless it's you, twice. And then you do.
Well, exactly. I mean, I spoke at the American Association of Palliative Care Physicians, and somebody said to me, what has death taught you? And I said, it has taught me to resolutely live. And I think that is the example here. I think you can resolutely live and reconcile the fact that you're going to die at the same time. I don't think those two things are different. And so once you have it sounds so 1930s, sort of Graham Greene, once you have your affairs in order, actually it's just one less thing to worry about. And there are ways and means. I mean, I live in Denmark, where all of that stuff is done digitally, and it's all on your health record, and it's all plugged in, and basically, you never have to think about it again. You don't have to go through some weird, sitting in some dusty office and writing down, do not resuscitate and all that stuff. It's all done for you. And then there are the other bits on top. Again, one of the big learnings that we found is once you open that barrier, once people have the floodgate is slightly open. And you start saying things like, well, what music would you like played at your funeral? And people are like, oh my God, I want the Bay City Rollers. Oh my God, I want XYZ played. Oh my God, I want this to be played. And I don't want to be with some weird, horrible coffin covered in lilies. I would love it to be, in a light room. And there is a way to add some, and again, these words are very loaded and I'm aware of my saying them. There's a way to add some poetry to it whilst you're still alive. That doesn't subtract from it and doesn't subtract from your life. It's just yet another thing that you don't want to burden everybody else with once you've gone. So many people, when asked, one of their greatest wishes is to die well. And die well means not die wired into a wall in a hospital and be remembered when you have gone well. And it is that latter piece that I think is very, very important to not forget as well, is that you are remembered and the last memory that people have of you is positive. And if you can help create that, that's a good thing, I think, in many cases.
I totally agree with everything you just said. And I'll maybe draw from a personal example here. About 4 years ago, last week, my dad was diagnosed with ALS and he was given 6 months to live. And thanks. And my sister and I had the privilege to take our lives, put them on hold, and actually be with him until the very end. And it's very interesting because my dad, he met it very courageously, I would say. But before he had this brush of death and the inevitability of it, he had a very different way of looking at it, right? And even during his time having to contemplate the sure end, and as he was declining and melting in front of our eyes, he changed his opinion on euthanasia. He changed his opinion on many different things back and forth, because the reality of this is you cannot be prepared for the end as much as you want to think about it. Now, these things that we're talking about that are like admin focused, of course, I don't think that is necessarily something that, is hard to contemplate. But I think the reality of facing it and being with it and feeling it and having to deal with the fact that it is a very lonely thing, even if when people are around you, is something that's hard to anticipate, is what I'm saying.
And the answer is, again, yes. Everybody goes up and down the spectrum here. I've been in rooms with people going, don't let me die. 5 minutes later going, let me die. Right. I mean, and that is just the reality of it. The body clings. Right. And there is no one answer. There is no one answer. All you can try to do wherever you can is A, maintain the center, and B, as much as you can. And it sounds as if you did, which I'm very happy to hear. Be with that person as much as you possibly can in whatever moment they are. I always say to people, I get asked a lot now, my parents dying, they've got 6 months, what's your advice? I always say the same thing. Enjoy it. Enjoy this moment. Enjoy whatever moments you can find of enjoyment in it. Not everything is going to be a total, is not going to be a total bummer. Not everything is going to be total euphoria, but try to find whatever you can in the center of all of that. There is no one answer to, is there a right or a wrong? But ultimately, at the end of the day, when that person is ready, and if they are ready, then it is your job to support them.
And let me qualify. I didn't mean to suggest that there is no value in still contemplating and preparing for it. I just think that one should not be as arrogant to presume that one can actually meet death in its entirety before one actually stands in front of death.
Well, it's too messy, isn't it? Is the point.
That's the word. That's the word.
Yeah. It's also it is undignified in its very nature. I mean, if someone's crapping into a nappy and being, force-fed when they've given up and they don't want to eat, but as you say, that 10 minutes later they do, it's so unpredictable. We're just at our most vulnerable in the same way that we are at the beginning of life. So I guess that's the question: is this as laudable and as much as I support the conversations about death, and that wonderful book that I'm going to mention here, Margareta, because you're in Scandinavia, Margareta Magnusson's book, The Swedish Art of Death Clearing. I don't know if either of you have come across it. Yeah. Just brilliant. And I think It was her first book at the age of 88. So no accident. Written during lockdown, during COVID. I just wonder if, just to turn this on its head, whether trying to design for death is another way of sort of mitigating against this fear of the unknown, and it's a sort of beautiful fiction.
I mean, yes and no. There are circumstances where it is good to be ready, and there are circumstances in which it is just not. You can overdwell on things and be like, oh my God, is it coming today? Is it coming today? Is it coming today? I'm not living my life. I'm not living my life. I mean, I've been around those people who've had, metastatic diagnosis and they're just sitting waiting to die as opposed to continuing to live. I've been around those people. And there are other people who are like, fuck it, I'm ready. Here's the playlist. Let's go. Right. So I think it depends on who you are and where you are and who you're with. But there is no one answer. But I will say one thing. You are not playing God by acknowledging death. You are playing being a human being at its highest form by acknowledging death. You're not trying to cheat death. No one pretends they're not going to die. It's just when. So you can stave it off as much as you can, and you can try to be as honest about where you are in the process as you can. But ultimately, as I said to you, Natasha, 100% market opportunity here. 100% of us go into 100% of us, this is going to happen to.
Well, so that's another question, just to get a little surreal and maybe sci-fi for a moment.
I know what you're going to ask.
You're talking about what?
Well, he's been in Silicon Valley. He knows all about this.
Let's talk about somebody like Brian Johnson, for instance. What do you think about him? And for the listeners who don't know him, he's the guy who people refer to as like a modern vampire because he took blood from his son, although I think that's a weird story. And he is trying to cheat death. He has this notion of don't die and a regimen that's called Blueprint, which, by the way, I'm on on a separate topic. But yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, so again, he's in my bucket. He's in my third bucket, right? In the bucket of extreme users who are trying radical experiments to see which ones stick, right? Now, there's a lot to be said for, living healthily. After I had a heart attack a couple of years ago, I take 41 vitamins a day too. So I have radically rethought my own health as a response to that. Now, I'm not swapping blood with people, but at the same time, I understand the desire to live as long as possible, as healthy as possible. It's the old Confucian quote, you have two lives. The second one begins when you realize you only have one.
I love that one.
Now, well, it's true. It's also one of the few that's actually true.
Yeah.
And once you have that realization, you do change things in order to be able to hold on. But to Natasha's point, Silicon Valley, there's a whole bunch of crazies there as well, doing all kinds of crazy shit, doing all kinds of stuff that is, I would say, not in the interests of kind of learning for all, but in the kind of vanguard for oneself kind of stuff, right? And I'm not a fan of that. Although I am very, very interested in, some of the early stage, there's some really interesting stem cell research going on. Psilocybin we talked about, sort of the ability to expand consciousness is a very interesting tool when applied to some of this stuff. So I would say there's always something to be learned from the fringe. You just can't exist totally on the fringe. You have to bring the fringe wherever you can into the mainstream. But also, there's money to be made here as well, and people are trying to figure out how to commercialize this. And, okay, so be it. I personally don't want to spend all my money staying alive for an extra 10 years. I'd rather have 10 great years and the money to spend. But there are a lot of people out there who are trying to do those things. Brian, I suspect, is one of them. Although I have to say credit to him. He's putting all his stuff out transparently. He's doing it in a very, very sort of open and honest way. He's got some degree of humor about it.
I agree. Yeah.
So I actually think he's pretty good. I think he's a pretty good role model for what should be happening.
100%.
But there are a bunch of people swirling around this, trying to figure out what's the business opportunity, and not surprisingly.
Yeah. We are talking about design space, and because we're in this weird world, let's just bring some other threads into it. There are people who could create LLMs, virtual clones, and all these type of things for us to stick around, right? How do you think about that? Will you consider that as part of the design space? Is that weird? What are your thoughts?
Cool, I guess. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of replicating yourself and all of the stuff that goes around it. I mean, again, I think in the idea of research, hugely interesting. There's a lot of stuff that's going on around stem cells and interesting sort of biological stuff that I think is very powerful. I will tell you one thing, which rose to the surface when we first started talking about death, which was, I don't want to just end up as some bot somewhere. I don't want to end up as some digital facsimile of myself sitting at a dinner table. So there was a huge degree of desire to be remembered in a very real way. I mean, the of all of the things that we designed, the thing that people wanted the most was a scrapbook. A scrapbook with pictures in it that they could actually touch. So in all of this digital kind of, digital world, the analog, the remembered, the human, the tactile, the sensorial, the touch, the remembered, the felt were very, very, very important to people, much more so than the kind of digital proxy of myself.
Let me now question whether what the sample was that you took, right? Because I would say the Snapchat generation, if I may call them that, or the TikTok generation that follows them, they may much more be interested. And if
you may be right.
Yeah. So if you think about the design problem of death as a design for the dying and the design for the people who are left behind, which Natasha so nicely kind of, when we had a conversation beforehand, kind of delineated, this may fall into the design for the people who remain, right?
Yeah, and you may be right. I mean, we were certainly not talking to teenagers at the time about the end of life.
Hard thing to talk about as well. Yeah.
Well, we'd had quite a lot of conversations about suicide and about stuff that revolved around suicidal tendencies, but we definitely were not talking to kids about dying. So you may or may not be right, and I would posit you're probably right there, that today's generation is much more comfortable with being in digital memory as opposed to in analog memory. Certainly my generation at the time and my generation and younger were very, very much more interested in being remembered as a person as opposed to as a digital presence. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of conversation at the time about how you died twice. Mm-hmm. You died once and then you died digitally. And I remember thinking that was a very interesting way to frame that up. So you may be right that now, as we get more and more comfortable with multiple versions of ourselves existing, many of which are not even real anyway, the idea that there's a sort of avatar me somewhere else may or may not be something that becomes of interest.
I don't know. Again, this is probably overly personal, but you've just prompted a memory. So this is almost 17 years ago, and I mentioned the timeline because where we were, we didn't have LLMs, we didn't have most of what we're using now wasn't available. But my late husband was like a digital native. I mean, he was someone who took to tech and sort of invented various things in the medical world. Or tools for advancement. So my son, aged about 8, I remember I had my computer on my lap and I was sorting out some admin after he died. And he said, started tapping on the keyboard and he said, his email, let's just go into that. And I said, but darling, that, you receive in email. I mean, what's the point of going into it? We'll just get messages that have bounced back because we've said, he said, no, that there'll be a way, we can get into that. We can get into a portal and we can find him. We can find a version of him because there's footprints everywhere. And of course, these are all terms and vernacular that we're very used to now, but it was so strange that he was preternaturally disposed in a sense and had these ideas of how to find him in another realm, if you like.
which I love. I love that story, actually. That gives me tremendous hope.
And it was deeply intuitive and obviously not monetized. And I mean, it was just his way of trying to ask his opinion about certain questions. And to be honest, they were mostly scientific questions that he had for him. What's it like to die? Where's your body? Where's the substrate? Is your spirit here? Is your soul in the computer? Where is it? I mean, all those wonderful, profound questions that kids have no problem asking.
Unbelievable. Your son went into the cave with a torch and he found his dad. He found his dad. And I mean, that gives me tremendous hope for this generation, that's the application of it, is not to try and live forever, but to try and actually find ways to reconnect with the, I told you this phrase, Ineon, this folds of time, this idea that time is folded and we meet multiple versions of ourselves as we go through space and time. He was finding a fold of time and space in which he was able to talk to his father in the cave. It's wonderful. So I love that story. I mean, and that gives me tremendous hope that this generation is going to start to think about those kinds of tools and those kinds of experiences as opposed to, robots, which just seems kind of lazy. But to actually be brave enough to go into the cave and ask your father, what did it feel like to die?
Let me make a kooky moral argument for it too, and that is, it'd be nice to still have Isaac Newton around and Albert Einstein to continue to contribute to the progress of society, because actually we may have been able to solve a lot of problems much faster if we keep the 10x brains that are just so extraordinary and have pushed civilization forward to an extent around to interact with, even with scientists, to talk to them and have a conversation with.
But do they then
something interesting
become
about that.
godlike and take up too much space and not make space for a new generation of thinking?
I don't think so. I think that's a lack of imagination to consider that the ghosts of scientists past will in any shape or form be a dominant force. And I actually think it's just more of an inspiration for people that, they can draw from.
This conversation is making me very, very happy. I love the idea of all of these sort of layers of time and space all kind of weaving themselves back together again. That people, great minds from the past and kids today can have conversations. It's very enlivening to hear things like this happening.
So I feel one of the, not conclusions, but where we've got to is that we can't necessarily design death itself because of the messiness and unpredictability of it. But we can perhaps redesign how we, as a culture, as a society, relate to death. And with that in mind, is euthanasia maybe the ultimate form of sort of design-led agency?
So I want to push back on a couple of those things first, Natasha. I don't think we can redesign death, but we can certainly redesign some of the rituals around death. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I was a kid, we lived in Singapore, and one of my earliest memories was there being a parade at the end of our street, and I went down and everyone was gongs and banging, and everybody was in red and dancing, and it was a funeral. And I remember thinking, good God, this is amazing, right? Or in Vietnam, they put fireworks in the coffin so that people, go off in these sort of amazing trails of light. So, Zen Hospice, one of the places where I was part of in California, have this beautiful ritual when somebody dies, and everybody's terrified of touching a dead body for some reason. Everybody's terrified of touching a dead person, like they're going to catch it from them. They have this ritual where they put the body out in the courtyard when they've died, and everybody plucks a flower from the garden and lays it on the body. And then they seal up the body covered in flowers. So I think there's space to do things like that, to add new dimensions to rituals, if you like. I think that's one thing.
And just name B.J. Miller's, will you say the name of that for us? We'll put it in the notes. But
Zen Hospice Project, Hospice Project, and B.J. Miller is the palliative care physician. But they have all kinds of, again, I told you, they bake cookies there. I mean, half the people who are there are not eating, but the smell of cookies makes them feel alive, I guess. It's just such a lovely thing to do, to remember. He said a line which I really love. Why does death have to be so anesthetic? Why can't it be aesthetic? And I love that notion of death doesn't have to be anesthetic; it can be aesthetic. So let's talk about euthanasia. I mean, I sent you both a piece that was from a colleague of mine who I'd worked with, who actually did assisted suicide with her mother, and she did a TED talk about it, and she sort of talks very openly about the daughter's journey of going through that, of her mother's wishes, what it felt like, the sort of journey, and was she ready and was she not ready, and at the end of the day, I think she fulfilled her mother's wish for her. So again, the answer is there's no one answer here. Some people, want to control. For me, if it was me, I've thought about this a lot. I'd be out in a heartbeat. If I had a stroke, or if I had some kind of metastatic stage 4 thing, done. I would want to be out of here as quickly as possible and as cleanly as possible. But for other people, it's not as easy as that. Everybody goes up and down the spectrum with that, with their own wishes, with fear, and fear comes in and out. But I do say, I think that assisted death, assisted dying, is not going away as an idea, and is becoming now something that a lot more people are actually demanding, and a lot more countries are considering, and a lot more places are starting to look at. So,
and we have had some progress here in the UK as well on that front. And if I can share maybe a personal perspective on this. I think it is absolutely a tool that should be available in people's lives. The undignified death is, I think, the worst way to go. And so if people want to have that freedom, I think they should have it. I want to just describe it from a very selfish perspective, how I felt when my dad brought it up, and ultimately it didn't go there. And I think it would have been better if it had been that way, because the way he was at the end, he didn't want us to see him like that. He didn't want to be like that. And let's put all that aside. In a month in hospital, which was just terrible. And then dying at home was also terrible. The point is, when faced with the notion that there's going to be a date in the calendar where he's going to die, had even nightmares considering and contemplating the finite countdown of this whole thing. I was thinking about how would I sleep 2 weeks before, 1 week before, knowing that is a date that we've picked, all the things that, I will have to still say and do and all that. And for some reason, chaos and randomness was much easier to contemplate as a notion than this finitude of like a specific date. And now that's super selfish of me, obviously, and I don't suggest that that should be a reason for anybody not to do it. But I just wanted to explain that I think it's a very asymmetric situation. It feels like. I'm going to ask you a very direct question. Did the chaos surrounding it make it easier because it was out of your control? Yes, and I think that in some ways, I also would like to say that if everything's already organized and finished, you have nothing to distract yourself with in the moments where it hurts the most.
Try and stop it from happening.
Yeah. So, as we had to deal with the logistics of getting his body back to Iran and all this type of stuff, you have something that you at least can focus on for the time being. And I'm not suggesting you should suppress all those feelings. We were going through those feelings for 18 months as he was around. Everything was bittersweet. Every single moment was bittersweet. But it is still sometimes solace to immediately in the aftermath have to deal with, oh God, what am I supposed to do? I've got to pick is it pine or oak for this? And all these type of things are sometimes maybe not a bad thing to have, is just a different perspective on it. Of course, I'm not trying to push back. Yeah. Well, back to my original statement a while back. Once you have all those things in place and if it's pine or cedar, it allows you to focus on something else, which is the death itself. Right. Because you can distract yourself with a million
wreaths and playlists, but actually you're distracting yourself from the person who really needs your focus. So had I have had the ability to fly home and have given my father assisted suicide, I would have done it in a heartbeat. And in fact, it's my biggest regret is that I wasn't able to do that for him. So because I wish I could have spared him what he had to go through in his last few days.
Yeah, me
but
too, by the way.
I hear you.
Yeah, me too.
You. It's
100%.
and again, thank you for your candor. It's very important that we share these kinds of feelings because, you know, this is a very gnarly topic and everybody gets very het up about it. I mean, for everybody that agrees with everything we've just said, there'll be people going, who are these people to play God to even have this conversation? You don't get this. You don't get the right to do this. You do get the right to do this. So it's important to have a conversation about it and bring it out to the light.
I think the point is that it's extremely nuanced and personal. And I think it is really interesting because there are trade-offs for the people who are going and the people who are staying that are part of the design space. And of course, the person who's leaving should be the priority, of course, but it's worth remembering that there are also people who have to still live a whole life with that memory of that experience.
You see, I think the inverse. I think the people who are being left actually are the priority.
Interesting, yeah.
Tell me, Paul, what were you going to say?
Well, if you watch Extremis, the documentary Extremis, which I sent you a link to, that entire show is essentially patients begging doctors to not let their loved ones die. Mm-hmm. Try one more thing, do one more thing, do one more whatever. Some Hail Mary might happen, and in 99% of the cases, it doesn't, of course. So I find this, again, is a very conflict. Everybody has different opinions. For me, it should be about the person who's dying and their goodwill and their sense of leaving. For me, my father's dignity was left behind. Yeah. And he did not get to take that with him. I robbed him of that in a way. I did not allow him to have that. He was not allowed to take that with him, which is what he wanted more than anything else. So, but you're right, Natasha. I mean, you know, everybody has very different perspectives on this. Some never want to be left. Some want to be left. Some don't want to be the person turning off the machine. Some want to be that there is no one way.
I think so much of it, and again, this may just be a moment in time, but my greatest fear is leaving or burdening my sons with aftermath, which they doubtless will be burdened with, or whoever's around. You don't want it to be messy, but it will be messy. It just will be, and there's nothing we can do about that.
Well, you can make it as unmessy as you can. Right, it's as simple as that. That is the doing some of the things that you need to do, like make an end-of-life directive and make sure that, you know, if X, Y, Z happens, I want these following protocols to be put in place. You can do those things, hard as it is, and you probably don't need to do them yet. But at some point you will, and that will make it easier by you doing it, they don't have to do it on your behalf.
I'm thinking more about cleaning out the cupboards in my bedroom.
Oh, I mean, God, I don't even talk about Swedish death cleaning. I mean, I'm going to need a Swedish death crew to clean my house out here because I've got so much shit here. Yeah, I mean, but again, you could also see that as a kind of act of love and of the bequeathing of things and of the passing on of things. And, you know, again, people do really nice things. I had a guy who had written little stories about all of the things that mattered to him, and he'd hidden them all over his house. And so when his family were clearing up and getting rid of all of his stuff, they found all these little notes that said, oh, I remember when I first showed you this, and I remember when I first bought this, and your mum and I bought this, you know. So you can find ways.
So it's a proper trip down memory lane.
It becomes it's a
Will you feel accompanied whilst you're sorting
It's a design opportunity. It is a designed opportunity.
Yeah.
You have designed a moment for your family to remember you through.
And actually, let me steelman that and kind of go back to Natasha's point is I think that we can set an example in the way we meet death for the people who remain. So, for instance, my dad, you know, having to deal with all this stuff, and I'm sharing more than I thought I would, but he was very courageous in through it all. He never cried or broke down in front of us. He was just continuously stoic in confronting his own demise and melting, really, and I thought that was a very powerful message that he was sending. And I think it's worth to consider that, as hard as it is, as we're facing death ourselves and are fighting this very solitary fight with our own mortality and coming to terms with it, that the people around us will draw something from this and the way we meet it, in a way. So I think it should also be about the people who remain, as Natasha pointed out, and not only about the person who passes. Yeah.
I don't need you to see me like this.
Yeah,
is the greatest gift. Is the greatest gift my father ever gave me.
Exactly.
A, it's the best creative brief ever, and B, it liberated me from having to see the version of him that he didn't want to even look in the mirror and see for himself, never mind present to his son.
Yep.
So I think you're absolutely right. I think this idea of, again, it's a loaded phrase, but creating creative briefs for the next generation, I think, is a very powerful way to start to think about this. What am I going to pass on? What am I going to ask them to do? What am I going to not do? What am I going to hide? What am I going to conceal? What am I going to share? How do I want them to discover me once I've gone? How do I want to be remembered? All of these things are design opportunities for us to think about as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point is that even though it will be chaos and randomness and messiness, and we may surprise ourselves in the way we actually meet this challenge, despite having thought maybe years about it, it is worthy of contemplation.
It's absolutely. I mean, I had a heart attack a couple of years ago, and I woke up on the floor of a hotel room in London thinking, "Oh fuck, here we go. Yeah, wow. Here we go." Right. So I'm sitting there in Euston Hospital in room 3. I'll never forget. And suddenly, crash cart to room 3 goes off, and the entire universe just explodes. And my entire thought was, "Oh fuck! Here we go. How am I going to meet this moment? Right? How am I going to meet this moment? And am I going to try to not be one of those people who freaks out and be crazy? I've studied this now. I know enough about this to not be some crazy person." And so, of course, I was a crazy person and kept asking if I was going to die and was I having a stroke and all the stuff that you do. But once you're there, and you realize that you're there, that's when it really shows up. When all this stuff that you've put in place, all these years, all this thinking, all this history, that's when it really shows up. When you're staring it right in the face, that's when it really shows up for you. How am I going to behave in this moment?
Yeah.
So in a sense then, by thinking about this stuff before we are confronted by it, because normally we'll only be confronted by it once, we are clarifying the way in which we want to live.
Exactly, Natasha. Back to what I said, what's death taught you? It has taught me to resolutely live. I am a better alive person for having dealt with death for so many years. I am more alive. I am more aware of the life around me. I am more grateful for life. I am more grateful for people who are enlivened. And, the wonders of life are now technicolor in a way that they never were before. And I used to, I was so cynical. I remember, for years, I was one of those sort of cynical, half empty kind of people. And after all of this, I was like, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm actually going to try to be my dad. I'm going to try to live up to my father's legacy for a change. And I'm actually going to be one of those people. And I'm going to resolutely live. And I have, actually. That's one thing I can say I've really done. I've resolutely learned to live. And when I meet people, you included, and when I connect with somebody and I want to say something to them, I do. Yeah. And so one of the things that death teaches you is it teaches you to be honest, because it's the ultimate tool of dishonesty. You can't cheat it. So you have to be honest.
Paul, I think This has been a really great conversation, and it's so nice to be vulnerable. It's, I think, the first one where we've been this open about our own personal experiences, and you've been the catalyst for this. And I think,
thank you both.
And I think that the point that you made that I'd love to highlight before I'm going to say thanks is we don't need LLMs or virtual copies of our parents to still keep them alive in our actions and the way we are in our lives. So that was very nice of you to say that.
Yeah, if you do one thing after this call your mum and dad and tell them you love them. Just do that. Just do that alone. I mean, I've given talks about this, and the number of people who've said, "Oh, I called my dad in Austria. It was 3:00 in the morning, and I just told him I loved him." And don't forget to do that kind of stuff. And when you are faced with the final moments, enjoy whatever part of it you can. There is still joy in this journey, even to the very end.
And beyond the things unsaid, the one thing that I miss the most is hugging. So I'd say hug more as well. Thanks so much for this journey together, Paul. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you both.